Hello, cult hackers, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Celine, a media graduate with an interest in cults.
And I'm Stephen Mather. I'm her dad. I'm an organisational psychologist these days, but I was raised in a high control group or cult, and now we have a podcast talking about it. So welcome everybody to the podcast. We're very excited today because we've got old friends coming back onto the show. Welcome Brian and Troy from I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thank you. I like the fact that you called us friends. You did preface it with old, of which we are as well, but it's lovely to be here.
Yeah, I'm more than comfortable with being old. That's fine.
Yeah. Well, I've accepted it now.
It usually is accompanied by wise, old and wise. So I am happy as long as you should have said, actually, here are some old and wise friends of ours, Brian and Troy.
I am happy to edit that in the after edits. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're very I've been watching your progress with your podcast. Obviously, we spoke to you. It must be a couple of years ago now. A year and a half ago at least, and a kind of lots happened since then. Your podcast has gone sort of mad. It's stratospheric. So what's been going on? Update us first of all before we get into all the culty stuff. Talk to us about what's been happening.
Yeah, it has been a big couple of years. I think it was towards the end of 2021, potentially, we spoke with you guys last. I mean, we've had you on, Stephen, our podcast since, but yes, I don't know what's happened. I think it's maybe we're in season 4 at the moment, about midway through season 4, and we had season 3, we had lots of interesting guests on. And, it grew, but then this year, Troy, all credit to Troy, started doing these ad swaps with other podcasts, and that has seen significant growth. So that's been a fantastic thing, and not growth for the sake of growth, but growth really to get out there, have more people listening. And we've seen quite a flip, particularly in the last maybe 4 or 5 months, where the vast majority of our audience now is in the US, whereas before it was Australia, with a peppering in the UK and the rest of Europe and New Zealand. But definitely probably more than half the audience now is in the US. And to quote Troy, I mean, that's where they grow fundamentalists. So I do think that it is something that we've tapped into a rich harvest, Stephen.
That's right, the fields are white under harvest.
You're now what are you, fishes of men, and all of that.
That's right, throw down your nets. But can I say, Brian, just before you go on, because all credit was mine, remember, and we were quoting me. No, actually, the idea for ad swaps, and I kid you not, came from Cult Hackers and the Cult Vault, because I was listening to one or both of those and heard the other and went, oh, this is a good idea. And then when I reached out to Stephen about doing it, he's like, oh, yeah, we already do that with Cult Vault. And I'm like, oh, do you? Okay, cool. So I think you guys were actually our first ad swap.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, it's great. It's a great idea, isn't it? We're really happy to do it. It just makes total sense. And obviously our audience is not exactly the same, but they've got a lot in common. So yeah, it's great that we're able to do that.
I was just going to say, I mean, some of those guests that we've had on too, I mean, just to be self-indulgent for a minute, Troy and I were big Keith Green fans back in the day. So Keith Green was essentially a prophet in the 70s, 80s in our space. And we've had a couple of people who've come out of the ministry that Keith Green and his wife Melody led, which was Last Days Ministries. So we've had a couple of people on there and we've really connected with them. And they've got a podcast now called Feet of Clay and Confessions of the Cult Sisters, and some really interesting storytelling through that of other culty things. So I think that we're seeing lots of growth in the area. We're seeing a lot of, I don't know, maybe it's because it's confirmation bias. We're thinking that maybe this stuff's everywhere, but I think it's more so that it's actually over the last couple of years, there's just more and more of it. So it's really interesting how much more appetite. We're having quite a few, I wouldn't say a lot, but we've had quite a few people reach out to us either through socials or our email and say, hey, I never went to church. I was never part of a religious community, but loving the podcast, loving your content, because it's giving them a bit of a window into a world which they were never part of, but have certainly observed. And you're seeing that through a lot of I mean, you've got the Duggars stuff, which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit today with Shiny Happy People. We've also got lots of Hillsong stuff that it's still coming out in the media where there's exposés. So I think it's becoming a little bit more mainstream in its news, and particularly here, it'd usually be, and it's still a bit tabloid, but it would usually be a 2-minute snippet on a current affair show where they're now having a spotlight on something for 15 or 20 minutes in a current affair show around cults of different types. And I saw some shorts actually earlier this afternoon, but there's something, I think it's on the Moonies, coming up and how they're recruiting in Australia at the moment in shopping malls.
Wow.
Yeah, because I think it was Casey that said, and sorry guys, it is your podcast and we're doing all the talking, but I think it was Casey from Cult Vault, and hi if you're listening and too bad if you're not. She was the one that said to me, cults are the new true crime in terms of
that's right,
podcasting. And so I think we're riding a wave, like all of us, all four of us. I think we're riding a wave, which is great. If only we could make money out of it. But anyway.
if only, yeah. It is still a real labour of love, but yeah, that is very true. Yeah, I'm very interested in asking that question, why there is this sudden seeming interest in this topic, and as you say, it's always difficult when you're involved in it, because clearly you are looking at this stuff more than you would have done before, so it sometimes feels like it's all happening and actually it was always there. But yeah, everybody I talk to seems to think that there is a lot of attention on these sorts of groups, and there's all sorts of possible reasons for that.
I mean, people have always been interested, I suppose, in terms of, when we would talk to friends, when you get past the, in the past, didn't used to talk about ever having been a JW, did you? It was something that you kind of closed the book on and was like, move on past that. Obviously, a very different position now with the podcast, but yeah, like when you get comfortable, you start talking to friends, they'd always have a lot of questions, wouldn't they? They'd be very interested because they're like, what is that? What are they doing? What is behind the curtain? So I guess, yeah, kind of getting that on a larger scale now with all the podcasts and, the documentaries and, exposés and stuff like that. It's just, it feels like those conversations having in living rooms and on, out and about with friends is now happening it feels like, yeah, it's happening on a larger scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wonder whether social media has a big part to play in this, because there's, plus the general, I suppose, zeitgeist of everybody shouting at each other about what they believe and what they shouldn't believe and so on. So there's a lot of almost kind of culty behavior, even in fairly mainstream circles, really, in terms of, you must adhere to this very pure form of something, and if you don't, then you're essentially shunned socially. And this, maybe we're coming into a period where actually this behavior is becoming much more familiar with everyone, which is kind of worrying a little bit in a way. I don't know whether you guys have noticed that.
Well, I mean, you see the whole Trump thing, and I know we're probably all bored of talking about Trump, but he is in a lot of ways very typical of that sort of cult leader, narcissistic, psychopathic kind of personality. And so I think in that sense, it's there. But I think that there was a time when people were talking about the psychopath in the workplace. That was a big deal for a while, maybe sort of about 10 years ago. And maybe now it's just sort of, I don't know, maybe it's part of a natural growth that people are starting to see the psychopath in other dimensions. And then, of course, we're better than cults, and it's sort of come back and the light's sort of shining. I don't know. I'm just speculating. I was in 2 cults, so for me, it's just old hat, to be honest.
Maybe the rise in discussing like narcissism as well, because obviously there's a lot of narcissist cult leaders out there, so maybe that's playing a part of it.
Yeah, that is a phrase that is a word that's being used a lot, I've noticed, on social media. And again, a bit like cults, really, it's sometimes it devalues the currency. So, if everybody's a narcissist and if everything's a cult, then it devalues the importance of some of the actual groups and actual narcissists. But yeah, it's certainly there.
I was just going to say, I think it's, these are fairly closed circles as well. Like, they're not something that people often get to peek into. So when there's an opportunity, and I've said this in our podcast before, that it's a little bit like watching a prison show. If you haven't been in prison, it's fascinating seeing what the systems, what is the currency within that space, and those sort of things, I think, pique people's interest. You can, and we have found this with some of the Hillsong stuff. It's a wash with the same old. Like, it's the same bloody story. And to be honest, I stopped watching and listening to a lot of the Hillsong stuff because I was like, oh, it's the same story. Like, they're not exposing anything else. But recently we had a documentary come out, and we interviewed the documentary maker, Mark Fennell, and he's an Australian journalist. And he spoke, it was definitely about Hillsong, and he was part of Hillsong growing up and is no longer part of that group. But he took a very different and maybe a little bit neutral as well. So it was interesting. He let the storytelling tell the story rather than try and do this expose. Everything's terrible. It's awful. It was very much make your own mind up about this. And he presented the facts and the evidence and really exposed in a different way what these groups were trying to achieve. And they're very businesslike. I mean, it's their recruitment is about growth. It's about income. All these groups are about making money, being rich, all that sort of thing. And I think that came out quite clearly without him having to push it. He let them tell their own story. And it was really, really clear, I think, to the watcher.
And it was really good talking to him too, because he was like family, because he knew it. He'd grown up in it. And so here we are talking to this mainstream journalist, and he's made this really swish documentary, and yet he was one of us at the same time. So it was really quite cool, because he's quite well known in Australia. And so it was kind of cool to get him on. And whereas we've had other folks who are mainstream media who've done stuff and they've never really been in it. And so you're still kind of trying to convince them of things, or you know that they don't quite see it that way. Whereas Mark, it was a really cool experience.
It's a really interesting question around how these things are investigated, and the same for academia, really. When looking at how these groups operate, there is still a bit of a division in the academic world around, whether to treat these groups as new religious movements, or very neutral, very respectful, and so on, or to actually identify some of the harmful practices. And that is still a tension, I think, that exists within academia. So yeah, maybe that'll never be resolved. You were mentioning there about the sort of mentality, the thinking behind these groups, and that was one of the first questions I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on. So the sort of mentality of fundamentalism, how people think when they're in a fundamentalist setup.
Well, I think there's a clue in the term fundamentalism. They know everything. Like, they've got all the answers, and to be a fundamentalist, I think, brings a level of security. I felt that security when I was a fundamentalist. I felt that, well, I don't need to look anymore. I've got the security of actually knowing. And if I don't know, that's okay, because it's God who lives in me who will know, and they'll direct me and certainly guide me through life. And even if, there's a little bit sidetracked, that's okay, because God's there and it's probably all in his plan. So in some way, it's a beautiful thing, because you don't have to look left or right. You just look straight ahead and stay on that path. But it's rubbish. And in the end, I think it is an arrogance as well. And he's just laughing at me, because yes, I do every now and then just go, yeah.
No, I'm laughing at you. Yeah, because you said it's rubbish, because it is. And it's just like, okay, now the colours to the mast. Don't hold back, Brian.
Say what it
is. Yeah. And look, I think I'm certainly a lot more pragmatic now than I was even a couple of years ago when we started the podcast. And it's been a journey to understand what I believe. But it's that certainty. I mean, and maybe it is, like we were saying before, Troy and I are old. Yes, we're old. And I think you do definitely, as you get older, get a bit more certain in the fact that there isn't as much certainty as you would hope. And you've really do go in with your eyes closed into life quite early, I think. And particularly then there's an immaturity. You stay at this maturity level, which is really quite damaging. And I've said this before, that a lot of fundamentalist friends that I've got that are my age, older than me, so in their 50s and 60s, they're quite immature in many ways if they have actually stayed true to their fundamental roots, because you can't challenge things. You can't actually think that there might be more than one way or a different path, because your path is the only path. So it's that arrogance, it's that certainty, and it's not seen as arrogance. That's the problem. It's seen as, oh, well, we've got the answers, so why wouldn't you actually jump on board? And that's one thing that I have an enormous issue with, because, as I said, I don't know around that certainty. What do you reckon, Troy? What are some of those key tenets of the people that we refer to as fundamentalists?
I'm just laughing because you're acting like you're the host of this podcast. Well, Brian, let me respond to that.
Hey, that's good. I like it.
It's cool. Yeah, we'll be really easy guests because we'll just do all the talking. Yeah. Actually, if you send me the file, I'll do the edit for you. No, I won't. I was driving past a Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall because my daughter's friend lives just near one, right? And for what it's worth, Stephen, every time I drive by, I think of you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So and she goes there a couple of times a week, so you're front of mind all the time. But I can remember being in there in fundamentalism or in church and being told that the Jehovah's Witnesses are not the true faith. They are completely different. They are a false version, yada, yada. So they're not us. Yet, of course, the more I walk away, the more I see actually the Mormons are just a brand of Christianity, a different brand, but a brand. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a different brand. Pentecostalism is a different brand. You got all these different brands. And it was actually the group that told me that you guys, when you were a Jehovah's Witness, are not of us, and yet that's just not the case. And so there's this othering that happens as well. And it's, and we talked about this, Stephen, when you came on our podcast recently, where we talked about, this sort of tribalism and this othering and in and out and all that kind of mentality as well. So, I mean, that comes into it, that there's this whole community and there's this very strong divide between who's in and who's out. And that brings you a large degree of comfort. And so even when I was in my sort of second Pentecostal group, the first one was quite harsh. They practiced shunning and all the kind of stuff that you would have seen as a J-dub. The second group was a lot more, it was just warmer. It was softer. And it was a really nice place to be until you finally did bump up against the walls. And then then you wouldn't be excommunicated, but it was kind of a soft shunning, So that's something that I think when I think about coming on your show and thinking about the way that the J-dubs were and the way that we were more alike than different, but gee, they like to focus on the differences, don't they? To say they're not us. And even within the Jehovah's Witnesses, you've got all these other breakaway groups and splits and yeah.
Jehovah's Witnesses are the only true religion. In fact, everything else is false religion. It's Babylon the Great as far as Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned. That it's all lumped together. So it's the same sort of message. I mean, what I think is quite interesting about the word fundamentalism, when I was growing up, I remember thinking to myself, we are fundamentalists, because we are trying to get back to the original first century Christian sort of way of worshipping. And I guess that's what Pentecostals are trying to do. That's what a lot of these other groups are trying to do. But it's such a difficult thing to do. And what are you basing that on? You've got a few texts in a very old book. And on the basis of that, you're trying to construct a religious way of living that mirrors a group of people 2,000 years ago. And that, if you think about the difficulty of that activity, that's, I think, why, of course, you get so many different views and so many opposing ways of looking at it.
Have you heard the term historylessness or historyless?
No, I haven't.
So the idea of historylessness, and this is what we see with a lot of these fundamentalist groups, is they are trying to pick up from, it's like the book of Acts ends and we begin. Yeah. And anything that happened in between isn't really anything to do with us, even though, of course, the Jehovah's Witnesses can trace their lineage right back to the Reformation and, and even further back, to Catholicism, although they don't want to it to be seen that way. They want the book of Acts to end, or the Bible to the canon to close, and they start, or however you want to look at it. And we were like that too. But just listening to you before about saying we want to recreate the first century, it depends on what you mean by that and which focus. Like we as Pentecostals say, we want the miracles and the healings and the Holy Spirit. Yeah. And then you've got others that would be, having another focus. And let's face it, it is impossible to do. Like that task of saying we're going to recreate the Book of Acts church or the first century church. The fact that we dress differently, I'm thinking about the buildings and how the Jehovah's Witnesses love the fact that they can, throw up a building in a few days, that kind of thing. Who did that in the first century? They were, running around in synagogues, and it's foolishness. Is I guess what I'm trying to say, that they think that they are, and so that's what historylessness is. So what they do is they ignore all the church history in between, because I don't have to take responsibility for that, for crusades and all these other things, and all the problems of the early church. We don't have to worry about that. We are just in God's true lineage, and that's what historylessness is. And I think it's something that's sometimes overlooked when people think about these groups, because the doctrines don't come from the Bible. The doctrines were handed down and they were adapted and things changed, etc. There is no historylessness, and yet that's what they try to do. Yeah,
I'm looking to get somebody on. If anybody out there is a scholar in this area, I really want to get somebody on to talk about the Anabaptists and how actually, if you look at Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't know much about how the lineage sort of works with evangelicals, but from Jehovah's Witnesses, their beliefs and everything very, very similar to the Anabaptists, and so. JWs like to think that they are, this pure worship was restored in the late 19th century in America for some reason, but it actually they have a tradition just the same as the local Catholic Church or the Church of England. It's just they just don't want to admit it. You're absolutely right. Yeah,
I think all Pentecostalism is pegged back to the Azusa Street revival in LA, and essentially from that is just a string of revivals, and that's the way that the church seems to grow each time. It's like, oh, there's another revival. So even recently there was one in Kentucky in the States that they called a revival, and it lasted for like a week. Even by, I think, Pentecostal terms in their loose measure of revival, that certainly wouldn't have hit the mark.
So I really wanted to nail that word, because it's something that our ex-JW listeners just won't be familiar with unless they listen to your show or other ex-evangelicals, because the word revival is just never used by Jehovah's Witnesses. So the whole concept of revival, just tell us what that actually means.
Well, my first church was called the Revival Center. So we were the center of the revival.
Right.
Look, to be cynical, revival, when Jesus has taken 2,000 years, right? Eventually some in the church actually work out, we've got to stop saying he's coming soon. But we need something on the horizon. We need something to look forward to. And so this is a revival. And look, there would be so many different definitions of revival, but in essence, what it is it's something that you can seek out, and it becomes this more pure form of God. Now, God is still everywhere, yet he manifests himself in sort of tangible, real ways. Like he invades this reality. He becomes purely, truly interventionist, that he's, people are sensing his presence, people are repenting, there might be healings, and a true revival, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but it's about the number of conversions. It has to end with a lot of people repenting and a lot of people converting to the faith. That's what they see revival as. And so we were in Pentecostalism constantly being told revival's coming, revival's coming. Okay. And then occasionally Jesus is coming, but revival's coming, revival's coming, revival's coming. And I do believe that there's actually a sort of replacement for the return of Christ. It's something to put on the horizon. It's something to keep, it's a carrot in front of you to keep moving. And so we would pray for revival. We would seek for revival. We would do our best to bring it about through holiness and prayer. And I think really from our perspective, revival was just something to keep us busy, to keep us focused on, because we didn't go door knocking, that's not who we were. But we would go to these prayer meetings and pray for revival. And these people that came onto our podcast recently to talk about Keith Green, who Brian was talking about before, was this prophet in the 70s and 80s, and his whole ministry would have these little revivals, but it was based on prayer, but it was also based on holiness. So they would sacrifice things, they would give things up, they would, whatever idols you had in your heart, you would burn your books that weren't whatever. And it was just this, and I think from a cult perspective, it's that demand for purity of going back to the original version of Christianity.
And I looked down and I see she had a knife right at my back. And of course, now I'm banging on the door, and the RA comes running from the computer in the hallway and opens the door. And I sprinted 3 stairs at a time up to my room.
Yeah, the culture at Bob Jones University is very much like other religious institutions. They created a shame structure. These structures are intended to keep people within the boundaries of what the group or the cult wants them to be in.
I was followed a lot my freshman year, second semester, because I got what was called socialed. The RA, the resident assistant on my hall, would follow me around from classes.
Being able to say that's Satan, being able to say something's controlling you in a negative way, so that you have to then dismiss those drives, and you have to dismiss your anger and the resentment, etc., is it's like tying someone's hand behind their back, because you're not teaching people how to address it.
Surviving Bob Jones University of Christian Cults is a thought-provoking podcast series that delves deeply into the history of Bob Jones University, the psychology of fundamentalism, the criteria for cults, and survivors' experiences. The series is premiering August 23rd, 2023. Please spread the word and leave a positive review to help other listeners like you find the show.
If you're enjoying the podcast, you can support it by becoming a patron. You can support the podcast for just £1 or $1.50 and receive a variety of Patreon benefits as a thank you. Don't forget to share the podcast, follow, like, subscribe, and rate the podcast on the podcast app you're using. A review is particularly helpful as it gets us recognised by new listeners. And finally, if you'd like to reach out to us and tell us about some cult hacking you've been involved in, or you just want to say hi, you can do so by going to culthackers.com and using the contact form. We love hearing from our cult hackers. Thank you for listening, and now back to the podcast.
I think also one key thing with revival is weird shit always happens. Like it's never a lovely quiet time with Jesus and we're just talking to people and they're going, I would really love Jesus. Weird shit happen. And there's some really famous revivals, for lack of a better term. One of them was the Toronto blessing, and that was back in the 90s. And that was enormous, the Toronto blessing. And it was a Canadian thing that then went global. It was a bit of a Bieber moment. And
I was about to say, just like Justin Bieber.
And incidentally, he was actually involved in the church of the Toronto blessing back in the day. And there was a prophecy that he would be a global leader and represent God. But, I think as we've said this before, so did thousands, if not tens of thousands of kids in that scene. But in there was, stories of people growing gold teeth replacements. There was, I was going to say angel dust, but that's a very different thing. There was like glitter that was falling. Definitely not angel dust. Although I would question maybe people had angel dust.
It was angels' wings. Feathers from angels' wings is where the angel dust come from.
And just people mooing like cows, clucking like chickens, running around, and apparently that was Jesus. And Troy, what did you do?
I simulated giving birth because God was doing a new thing through me. I know.
Okay, can we have
But
a reconstruction of that right now,
yeah, sure.
please?
All right, here we go. Hold on, I'll put my foot up in the stirrups. It was a bit like that, truly. And it's embarrassing. I've said it on other podcasts. I've said it on our podcast that I simulated giving birth.
Oh, wow.
And I did. Yeah, I was open to suggestion.
Wow.
This was, I just want to put it on the table. This was a pivotal point with Troy and I where we actually departed a little bit from that similar direction and trajectory we were on, because the Toronto blessing, I just went, this is a crock of shit. I do not believe that it is from God or whatever. I just think it's hysteria. And it was a divisive part, not just with Troy and I in our beliefs, but really in the church. It really did divide a lot of people. And you've seen that with revivals quite often. And the church that's usually having the revival or the movement is very much like, well, people aren't going to get on board. They're going to miss God, aren't they? They're going to miss the blessings of the Spirit. And that manipulation just starts over again.
And we were told for so long that it was coming. Like for me, when we've been told that this is, it's coming. And then when that broke, I was totally going to give it a go. And, I didn't stay in it forever. I don't know, maybe a year. I sort of sniffed around there and stuff. But, I take it easy on myself going, okay, if this was what I was fed and this is what I was told, well, I wasn't going to chuck it in right away, because what if I missed out? What if this was God, I
think that's really interesting. So revival, from a sort of sociological perspective, it's like and a psychological perspective, it's like breaking and remaking something, and that's actually a really good way to for something to have longevity is this constant remaking of something. And actually what revival seems to do for these churches is provide an opportunity for them to remake themselves, and it even sort of emphasize new things, perhaps drop some other things, as well as this, it replaces this return of Jesus. It actually fulfills quite a few functions by the sound of it to me.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, you definitely see, you can't deny that through these revivals, in inverted commas, you see church growth. Yeah. You absolutely see these movements actually not only grow in people, but grow in influence. And quite often you'll see movements sort of folding into each other and almost like takeover bids, and they'll just become part of that. And you've seen that with the Australian Christian churches in Australia, where it was, the Assemblies of God, and then it's sort of morphed into this Australian Christian churches, and it's all become a little bit same as well. And it homogenizes the movement in many ways and consolidates, keeps moving forward, picks up more followers along the way, and then gets a bit more business-like in its approach too, which I think we've seen with Hillsong. We see with lots of movements, even like Bethel in the States as well. It's a very, very astute business model.
It's quite important to me in terms of the way that kids and teens are brought into these groups, or regardless of born in or joining, just because I feel very lucky and privileged that my dad decided to leave when having me, because thanks. So yeah. So it's kind of one of those things I was thinking about. We've spoken to a few people that joined in their teenage years into these kind of groups, like they're approached on the street and said, oh, we're doing this event today. I think you'll really enjoy it. Come along, and people get sort of swept into it. And I was just thinking about ethics, the societal kind of response to that as a model. Because I was sort of talking with my other half, and we're saying, if you want to join a club as a kid or a teen, you have to get parental permission and sign something, but you can go and join a whole religious movement, get brought in off the street and have your all of this inculcation happening without even having your parent or guardian necessarily having to give any consent to that. I'm not saying that obviously parental consent is going to always save you. Obviously there's born in kids that are raised in it because of how they were brought in by their parents. But I was just wondering, how do you guys feel about the approaching of younger, minors effectively into these groups?
Yeah, well, Celine, I don't know if you heard, but I was a teenage fundamentalist. And so was Brian. And so we were both recruited as teenagers. And I as Bugs Bunny says, took a wrong turn at Albuquerque.
Mhm.
That's how I see it. I see it as, if that hadn't happened to me, I would have had a very different life and a very different story to tell. And maybe my trauma would have just manifested in a different way instead of a religious way. Who knows, right?
Mhm.
Who can say? But there were groups at my school that, one was run by a teacher. And so he actually had a Christian club, which was aligned with the Baptist Union here in Australia. And he would have a Christian club, and once a week, the Christian kids would come. And I remember the first time I went along, because I wasn't a Christian, but I just wanted to see what the hell these people were doing. And he was sitting there with them strategizing, how are we going to get more kids to come? And I joke about that because the irony is my friend and I were there, and instead of stopping and talking to us, they went along with their strategy meeting. But it was a strategic thing that they were doing, and they were funded by Keswick Scripture Union and other sort of Baptist aligned groups. I know that Hillsong do a pancake breakfast thing that they were taking into schools. They're really clever because they know if they went in there and started saying Jesus and handing out Bibles, then the shit would hit the fan. So they do the events. And what happened was, for me, was a group of girls from the school performance, the school drama that I was in, actually went along on a weekend to a church group, because that group had sent a band into the school. And the band had played at lunchtime, and they said, hey, if you really like our music, come along. And then they went along and had, their conversion experience, and then came back. So it was all very strategic and all very well done. And I think that it was interesting, the point you made, that there was never any permission slip. There was never anything, like you said, you have to do that for scouts, you have to do that for the football, but you can go to a church and give far more authority and far more control of your life to these groups without having to do any such thing. So I was whisked away on camps by one of the groups that I ended up joining, and they love bombed me and all the things that they do, and I ended up as a teenage fundamentalist. So I'm very much against the idea of recruiting teens. Even Billy Graham, the famous evangelist, he said, we've got to get them young. And the majority of people that he would actually aim for were young people, up into the sort of their low 20s. It's a strategic move by the church. And that's why I think people relate to our podcast, because if you were a teenage fundamentalist, you are going to be far more impacted and far more, dare I say, traumatized than if you join later in life and you've already got a sort of a more formed personality and a more formed sense of identity. So, yeah, I think it's very intentional, strategic, and I think it should stop, truly.
I think also there's particular vulnerability when you're a teenager, which is, I have a real issue with that and I do think that there is an intentional targeting of that. For me, I was definitely someone which I think a lot of teenagers are the same. I was trying to work out, who am I? There's lots of confusion around, contextualizing life and what's it all mean. And I think you do, even though you're sometimes not consciously searching, you're searching for something. You're searching for who you're going to be, who you're going to become, all those really deep psychological things that are happening to teenagers that they've got no fucking idea. So I think that for me, I wasn't targeted by a church. I was more so targeted by my two brothers who'd become Christians in the year or two before this happened. And I don't think, again, they were intentionally targeting me, trying to recruit me. They just wanted what they had found, and they had certainly seen positive changes in their lives. But I think it's a lot more sinister most of the time. I do think there is a targeting. And I remember growing up that you had religious education in school. And for us, it was either you went to the Baptist or the Catholics. And sure, you'd have 45 minutes of religious education once every few weeks, but then they didn't say, and then come to our youth group on Friday night, and Saturday come to whatever, and Sunday we've got this service. That happens now. And as Troy said, it's through the pancake breakfast and feeding of the hungry, and there's a real motive behind them doing that. My partner, she has never been involved in a church before. She's not religious at all. And she's involved in this group locally, which is actually run by a couple of churches, which it's feeding people who are acutely mentally unwell and homeless. But what I love about it, she's been involved for a few years. What I love about it is that there is absolutely no mention of church. Like, they are doing it from a genuine, we are going to feed these people. We're going to help them if they need accommodation, and we're not going to target their souls. Whereas these other high control groups like Hillsong and other Pentecostal groups, and I'm sure J-Dubs and Mormons, they all do it for the outcome they want, which are more souls, notches in the old salvation.
Yeah, but just immediately you said that just made me think of there's a lot of J-Dubs that learn how to do sign language, or the sign for people that are deaf and blind, and then they can go and indoctrinate those specific people, because there's a lot of people can't communicate with them because we don't, unfortunately, in schools learn those languages. So, but they can now go in and proselytize to them, and that gives me, to put it politely, the ick. But it's grim. But yeah, that's again, and it loops back into what you're saying earlier. This arrogance, I think, of coming in and saying we have the truth. We're going to learn their language so we can go in and bring this here for the purposes of the religion, getting the numbers up. Obviously, I know it's difficult because that's kind of how I feel makes me angry, but I know that there's people that they're doing it because they think they're doing a good thing. It's very complicated. But to loop back in as well, obviously we all share quite a strong feeling about bringing in sort of minors into these groups. I mean, obviously it's bad and we shouldn't be doing it, but what do we do to combat that? How do we stop that? What should we be doing?
I think both Troy and I have live examples of this with our children, actually. So I'll share mine and then Troy can share his. But this was only, it's probably 2 months ago. My oldest stepson, he's almost 17. He came home with a friend, and the friend had only been here 1 or 2 times, and then another good friend. And he said, "Can I go to church tonight?" And he has very, very clearly actually exclaimed that he's an atheist, and he comes from good, strong atheist stock. And I was like, and I had a reaction. Troy knows this because I was messaging at the time, and I was having a meltdown, and I probably didn't. No, not I probably. I didn't handle it very well because that kid was here, and I said, why do you want to invite the other kids here? What is it? What's behind it? Do you think that they need Jesus? And he's like, oh, no. And I said, well, okay, answer me this question. If they don't accept Jesus in their life, do they go to hell? Oh, no, they don't go to hell. I said, well, there's no point in them going with you, is there? Because they've got other friends elsewhere. And I was just, so what I did, I guess, as a way of combating, I said to my stepson, look, you're going to go and it's probably going to be a fun night. And there won't be a mention of Jesus. You won't hear it, but you'll have a great night. And there'll be a bunch of other kids around about your age, and you'll relate. And then you'll go, oh, what was Brian talking about? He's full of shit. He knows nothing. I said, but let me guarantee you, when you go back next, or when you go back to another event, there'll be a peppering of religious undertone and Jesus. And 4 or 5 events in, I promise you that there'll be some pressure turned up, and you will definitely feel, or maybe you won't, maybe you're a frog in a pot, but maybe you will feel the fact that it has got a little bit more intense, and there's a bit more urgency around you making some sort of commitment to this group and ultimately to Jesus. Otherwise, you're pretty much going to burn in hell. So yeah, it was troublesome. But Troy, you've got a similar example.
Well, I was just going to say what you should have done, actually, is you just should have said to him, here's some money, go and buy some drugs and some booze. As a matter of fact, I'll get the booze for you. And that's how you could have countered it, right? You could have just done some competing fun. That would have been good. Now, look, my son has, he knows about the podcast, and I've told them the story over years, or bits and pieces of my story. And so they know about that. And my son came home one day because one of his friends was trying to convert him at school. And it was funny because I guess it'd be the same for you. He came home with pretty much the brand of Bible that I used to use. You know, he brought home an NIV study Bible, of which I've had two different ones. And he brought it home. His friend had given it to him. And I'm like, oh. And he's saying, oh, no, this is different, Dad. This guy's not like the one that you were in, but he's already brought the same Bible. And I said, oh, yeah, what's the name of the church? And he told me the name of the church. And I said, yeah, well, that guy used to teach me in Bible college. The pastor that's there now teaches me in Bible college. And he's saying the names of these people and this stuff. And I'm just coming straight. And it was totally exactly the same as where I'd been. And it was really funny because my son just goes, oh, okay, then. And I got a good relationship with my son. And he was just like, oh, it is the same. Okay, I'm not going. I said, look, if you want to go, I'll go with you and sit next to you. Right. And then because I'd just be sitting there going, okay, here comes the three fast songs, 2 slow songs. After that, this is going to happen. And I would just be sitting there. I wouldn't have been going, they're doing this, they're doing that. I would have been saying, what do you think they're doing now? Why do you think this is happening? And I would have totally ruined it. But he introduced his friend to the podcast, and his friend had a couple of listens. And I'm not saying that we did this, but last time I checked in with my son about this, he doesn't go to church anymore. He's actually given it up. He thinks it's all bullshit now as well, yada, yada. So that was kind of cool. But I think I have definitely vaccinated my kids against religion, but in a good way, in the sense that I don't keep them from it. Hey, you want to go? Okay, you go, but I'll come with you. And now neither of them are interested at all.
While we're on this subject of children, it might be a good time to talk about the Duggars. I know it's not an Australian thing, but it's and it's not really something we knew much about. But this documentary came out, Shiny Happy People, and so I started to go down that particular rabbit hole and learn about this family, the Duggars. What do you know about this group, the IBLP? Is this something that is kind of related to the group that you were in?
Yeah, definitely. So I can remember years ago, we're talking 1991, 92, somewhere around there, a good friend of mine from my church who went to Bible college with me, he said that he wasn't coming to church next week because he was going to the Bill Gothard conference in Adelaide. We're in Melbourne. So he was flying to another city to attend this. And I'm like, who? And he's like, oh, Bill Gothard, he does this, does that. So he's the IBLP, or was the IBLP founder, leader. And it turned out that it was at Paradise Assembly of God, which is where the then head of the Assemblies of God in Australia was actually the senior pastor. So whilst there may not have been any sort of official IBLP products or anything like that sort of circulating around in the churches we went to, their emphasis and their connection was definitely there. And, the stories that you hear from the IBLP that from that group, that Cabbage Patch Kids are cursed as they are leaving the factory, which is why you can't buy a Cabbage Patch Kid. I mean, we heard all those kinds of stories. Really? And the complementarianism, the idea that the husband is above the wife. I can remember my pastor at the time when I was his assistant pastor, his youth pastor in a country town. He actually said to me about my wife, she became my wife. At the time, she was my girlfriend, and she was university educated. She had a career. And he said to me one day, he goes, I think you need a woman that's going to darn your socks, not a woman that's going to be like this. And this was the kind of advice that I was being given. So whether IBLP was directly influencing that, whether we were influencing them, it's such a big hodgepodge, the evangelical world. But definitely it was something that had its influence on us in the 90s, which is when we were Pentecostalling.
Yeah, for those of our listeners that aren't aware of that documentary, I think it's on Prime, Amazon Prime. I think you can get it through that. Shiny Happy People. It's about the IBLP. Well, actually, it's about the Duggars, which was a family. I suppose it's one of the original kind of reality TV shows. Really, this family growing up. They had how many kids? 19 kids or something, and we followed them and saw all the way that they brought up their children and so on. So yeah, that's the background. If you don't know about it, I'd really recommend watching the documentary. It's very, very interesting. Sorry, Brian.
Do you remember, Stephen? So I was just going to say really quickly, Brian, do you remember, Stephen, in the Monty Python movie? What was the last one?
Holy Grail, was it?
Meaning of Life?
No.
Meaning
the
of
Meaning
Life.
of Life. Yeah, in The Meaning of Life, where they have this Catholic family and the woman's actually at the sink and she's washing her dishes, and then all of a sudden this baby falls out between her legs while she's washing the dishes, and she goes, "Get that for me, will you?" And and that's what the Duggars are like. They're like this modern version where they've just got a million kids. So even that, like, we look at it and go, can you believe this? A century ago, that was Catholicism, right? Or maybe not even that long ago, that you just weren't allowed to use contraception, and so you had all these kids. And so the idea of what they call quiverful, which is God grants you a quiver full of arrows. It's a metaphor for your children, and probably sons more than daughters. But this is not new. And so the idea of, and I think I saw it on a meme the other day as well, where it was one of those stickers on the back of the car, which shows the dad and the mum and then all these little kids going down. And there was this whole heap of kids, and someone had written with their finger in the dirt, for fuck's sake, get off her, right? Because they had all these kids. But I mean, that's how it is. So, they got 19 kids and they make a reality show out of it and think this is a good thing. I mean, the woman's life was in danger in her last pregnancy.
Yeah.
But it's also, back to that arrogance again of having all the answers. IBLP, it's the Institute of Basic Life Principles. Yeah. So we've got all the answers. We've got all these basic life principles. If you just follow them, everything will be fine. I'm sure you'll probably be incontinent by the time you're 2 because you've had 19 children, but it's okay. Basic life principles. It's that sort of thing. It's the purity culture too, which really feeds into that abuse of women. And we certainly saw purity culture probably not as full on as IBLP within our Pentecostal scene, but definitely was very much up there. Individual purity is something that is incredibly valued and that is protected at all costs, and particularly within IBLP. I mean, I've listened to a couple of interviews with people who went through that system, and it's incredibly patriarchal. I mean, if the women do anything that's outside of what is allowed within the boundaries of purity culture, they're damaged goods. But the men aren't. The men just keep pushing forward, and they're okay. That's okay, because the woman tempted them, obviously, and it goes back to that original sin idea. It's Eve, it's Eve that did it, and it really plays into it, and it's absolutely horrible. And the damage done to women, I mean, all the podcasts I've listened to have been interviews with women who've come through it, and it's the same theme. They're incredibly damaged, and they're talking about, even if they came out in their 20s and their 30s, and now they're in their 50s and their 60s, they're talking about their relationships being tarnished forever, their future relationships, because they have to work so much harder to actually make them work. And their new partners have to understand that trauma that they've been through, so they're not triggering them with things that they are unknowingly potentially triggering them with. So it's so incredibly damaging.
My ex-wife actually said to me, she was raised in the church, and she said to me one day, we were talking, and she goes, blah, 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 blah. Oh, that's because you used goods. And I said, what? And she goes, yeah, you're used goods because you have had sex before we got married. And it was like, oh, thanks. Is that how you see me? And that's how she saw me. And, they talk about, that you are like chewed gum. It's like giving a piece of chewed up gum to your future partner. And it's just all this shaming, and it's slut shaming of women. And for what it's worth, it's also, to a degree, a much lesser degree, but there's sort of, slut shaming of men as well. And I just kind of laughed when she said that to me, but she was dead serious that I was used goods. And it's like, yeah, baby, that's the way it is.
It's something I was listening to on the Indoctrination podcast actually recently, where they were talking about the purity culture stuff and the relationship with like complex PTSD and things like that, and that actually they're starting to realize the effects of that and how, like you say, it's going to have those reoccurring effects throughout, and it does take working through. It's one of those things you don't just stop yeah, it's one of those things, you know, people say, why are you still talking about this after you've left these groups? And it's because it takes a lot of talking through and working through. It's not like you stop and everything to do with purity culture, for example, just poofs away because you're like, oh, it's not real, it's fine. That's something you've been indoctrinated in for years and years, maybe all of your life, maybe for a portion of your life, but it's still, yeah, creates trauma, it still impacts you, and you have a right to talk about it.
Yeah, I actually wanted to, that was a topic I wanted to ask you guys about, because I think it's one of the things that people who have never experienced this sort of life, I think sometimes find difficult when we talk about trauma and the difficulties and all of that. I think hopefully most people that listen to our podcasts sort of recognize that, but I think it's still worth asking the question, what are we actually talking about? Why is this traumatic? Why is it traumatic to come out of a religious setting? You know, what are the issues that people like us actually have to deal with?
Well, I think Europe went through its own religious trauma. It was called the Dark Ages. And then came the Enlightenment, right? And if you think about it from a societal perspective or from a historical perspective, when the church had control, it drove a lot of things into the ground. And we look at basically what it did to, you know, to entire countries. And then you had the Enlightenment when people started to wake up to this. And there's this throwing off. There's this resistance to these old ways of thinking. And I was thinking about this yesterday or today when I was walking, that really that is a macrocosm of what happens for people in a micro sense, that if we think that the Dark Ages were bad for society or bad for culture or bad historically, whichever way you want to define it, this is what fundamentalism does to the individual. And this is what fundamentalism does to families, that it actually constricts, that it constrains, it reduces your ability, as Brian said before, to grow, so much of that. And yet I think when we look at these sort of individuals coming out of this and stepping into sort of freedom, I think the difference is, once upon a time when this was happening, you know, as I said a moment ago, to Europe, there was no other voices, there was no freedom. Whereas now people can actually, they've got something to relate it to, or something that to which it can be relative. And I think because we see it didn't have to be this way, because we see I've actually missed out on so much, whether it's through pop culture that we see around us, or whether it's through our friends at school, we are aware, we're acutely aware that something's not right and that something is holding us down. And I think that in itself is part of the trauma. I wonder if there was nowhere to escape to, if there was no other objective reality to look at and see, I wonder if we would call it trauma. I wonder if we'd even measure it as trauma. I wonder if we would just sort of say, like we did, 500-600 years ago, this is just the way it is. And look, maybe I'm being too philosophical, too esoteric in that, but I think part of the trauma is the fact that we can see both while we're in it and we make these concessions to stay and we give up. When we do finally wake up to it, there's a sense of loss and there's a sense of grief. And I think that's a big part of the trauma. I'm not saying it's all the trauma, but I think that's what makes it so hard for people, because especially when you have sacrificed so much and it turns out to be for a fiction.
Yeah. Brian, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you lose your sense of safety as well. And I think that's a really big thing that keeps people in it. So even when there is an objective view, unless they've got something safe to go to, or at least a perception of safety, they're not going to leave it. So that control is definitely there. I mean, these are called high control groups for a reason. They exert a very high level of control. And guests that we spoke to recently, DL and Crispin Mayfield. Crispin is a therapist in the States, and he wrote a book, I think a year or two ago, about attachment theory and related it to God rather than the parent and child relationship.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. And he definitely spoke about it in our interview with them. And it really resonated with me because it was very incredibly unhealthy, that relationship, and an incredibly abusive relationship with the fundamentalist evangelical God, or the J-Dub God, or even the Mormon God, you know, that vengeful God, that if you do not do the right thing, and sometimes you won't even know what the right thing is, because, you know, God likes to surprise you with a little bit of punishment, that he will whack you and he will punish you. And it's that sort of stuff which really messes with people's heads. And that's what keeps them in these groups, because there is a sense of safety. Now, it's a perceived sense of safety. There's no real safety. It's actually damaging you and continuing to damage you. But the perception of safety is the real game-changing trick that these groups have, because they've fooled you into thinking that the incredibly unhealthy attachment that you have to their movement and to their God that they present to you is a safe place, when it's not.
That's so interesting. That's the first time I've ever heard anybody else talk about that. So it's something that so we had Alexandra Stein, I think I mentioned before, on our show, and she's used attachment theory, but she tends to use it as a way to understand the cult leader's relationship to the individual. And when she came on the show, I actually put this to her. For me, Jehovah's Witnesses have created this God, Yahweh, however you want to describe it, but very much drawn from the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. And this is a very scary, narcissistic God. This isn't like the Christian God in many ways. This is a God that changes his mind constantly. One minute he's a God of loving kindness, the next he's a God of jealousy and fear. And it's very much like an abusive relationship. That's something that I've put to a number of people, and very rarely do experts want to go down that particular route. And I think I understand why, but that is so interesting. Yeah, and I think it's that destruction of self, isn't it? And it's the feeling that when you come out of this situation, you're so you're confused about who you are and what you think about all sorts of things and how you feel about everything. It's damaged that sense of self. So that's a big part of the trauma too. But that's really interesting. And who is that again? Sorry, I missed the name.
It's Crispin Mayfield. So there are a couple, DL and Crispin Mayfield, and they have a podcast called The Prophetic Imagination Station.
And the other one that we did too, Brian, was we had Catherine Queering on the show. And she was also talking about the narcissistic God and the picture of this narcissistic God. And the comedy of this is it's a fiction. Yeah. That people are in a relationship with this fictitious, it's like having a relationship with Mickey Mouse, you know, or Indiana Jones. And yet the power, because it's this imaginary friend that you actually are told this is how this, it's just such a great con, isn't it? That you're actually sitting there going, I am afraid, I am in relationship, I am actually having my psyche, my emotional well-being, all this sort of stuff impacted by something that doesn't even exist.
Yeah,
it's just absolute craziness. And yet this is what we see. And the fact that Crispin wrote this book on attachment theory really speaks to me that was his journey out, because as he wrote this book, and he wrote it for a fundamentalist audience as a fundamentalist himself. And then he realized, oh, this relationship isn't good for me. And then realized, and if that's true, then this entity doesn't exist. And now he's deeply
yeah. And of course, what it does from a cult perspective is often people think about cults as having a single charismatic leader, and of course they're often narcissistic in their personality, and so when we think about groups like Jehovah's Witnesses or even evangelical groups, sometimes they do have a very charismatic leader or pastor, but for JWs they don't really. There isn't a charismatic leader there. But so my argument is, essentially, this God that they create becomes the charismatic leader that then controls people it's controlled through the leadership. So yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, last time we spoke to you, you were actually called B&T, and obviously since then you've come out and you've revealed your true self. You've got a great little website there that we'll put a link to, so people can see what you look like and who you are. But the one thing I was going to ask you last time that I didn't really get into was the whole speaking in tongues thing. So this is something we did touch on it, but I'm really curious about what that feels like to actually speak in tongues, because it's so alien to most of us. We certainly didn't do that as Jehovah's Witnesses. What's
that's
that
because
like?
you weren't truly saved, Stephen. That's why.
Yes.
Because you didn't have the truth, brother. Yeah, you didn't have the truth. You thought you did, but you didn't. It's funny, because when I reflect, and Brian and I are thinking about doing an episode where we're going to look back at our conversion stories, because we told them at the very beginning of the podcast, and we've done so much growing, both as individuals, but also as our understanding of everything that sort of happened to us through the podcast, through doing the podcast, that it's kind of time to go back. And speaking in tongues for both of us was very early on and was very closely linked to our conversion. In fact, I was in a group that said you have to speak in tongues to be a Christian. And so everybody, and this is again historylessness, right? Everybody that's ever claimed to be a Christian that never spoke in tongues prior to the 1900s, we're not Christians. But I was never really convinced of my speaking in tongues experience. I was expecting it to be much more profound, much more, and people would argue, Pentecostals would argue, oh, it just shows that you didn't really speak in tongues. But so many people that I speak to have said the same thing, that, I didn't really think it was a thing, and I didn't really think I had it. And I think people that are more honest with themselves will, even within the groups, because I had people coming to me going, oh, would you pray for me? I don't think I've really got the gift of speaking in tongues, because nobody did, but you all convinced yourself that you did. And so when I finally got it, the pastor said to me, that's it, Troy, you've got it. You're just waiting for someone to say you've got it. And I was like, oh, I didn't feel any different. It didn't, I could do this sort of shunda shunda la la la, this kind of thing. There you go. There's a little bit for you. I could do all that, and yet it didn't mean anything. Yeah. But then the longer I stayed in the group, the better I got at it. I could speak in tongues better. I was, I can remember the first time I got home from this camp where I did speak in tongues for the first time. And my brother, my older brother, he's 4 years older than me, and he sat me down and he goes, go on, do it then. And I'm going to simulate, this is not me speaking in tongues, but this is what it sounded like. And it was sort of this, like this. And my brother just looked at me and goes, gidalum, like this back at me. And I was like, yeah, okay. Later, by the end of my time, dude, my tongue, it sounded like Hebrew or Arabic or whatever, because it had just been years and years of doing it, and you get better at it. And they would actually say that to you, oh, you'll grow into your tongue. That's what they would actually say. Like, does God give you this miracle thing or not? Well, obviously not, because you're going to grow. What they really mean is you're going to get better at this over time. And the cognitive dissonance must have been there for these leaders as well, because they must have heard people. There was people that would speak in tongues like this, right? That doesn't sound like a language to me. Yeah, exactly. No. So what did it feel like? It became very natural by the end. Even just a few years in, it became very natural. It became very normal. Everyone around you was doing it. But it's not proof of anything, is it? Like it doesn't, I remember someone came along to the Revival Center once. A friend of mine invited them, and they're talking to them about the proof of speaking in tongues. And this guy walked out and said, proof of what? You're just making noises. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of people convincing themselves of things, and I was once one of them.
It's really interesting. That's fascinating.
I think for me, it was, I thought it was legit, even though I had to be coached to receive it. So essentially it's repeat after me, and you would definitely get coached into it. But I think the reason I thought that it was fairly legit was it actually brought me comfort when I did it. So if I was feeling anxious, or I was feeling like I needed to dig deeper into God, like I didn't have the words myself, I would let the Spirit speak for me. And that's
maybe you really did speak in tongues, Brian. Maybe that's what's going on here. Like, you think you were a bad Christian. Maybe you were the real Christian.
Maybe I wasn't given it. I've given it all up. But it brought me comfort, I think, because it sends you into a bit of a meditative state. And, psychologically, there's a fair bit of evidence around this, that it does actually take you into a little bit of a trance-like state in many ways as well. And I remember I hadn't spoken in tongues for years. After I left the Pentecostal movement, I went to more of a mild expression of Christianity, and tongues just wasn't something that was used. So it was probably like 10 years. And I was like, every now and then I'd roll it out for a bit of fun, but certainly not at a public prayer meeting like you would in Pentecostalism. People would be shouting in tongues, like you'd have a room full of babble. And I remember when I went through a couple of particularly traumatic experiences in my life, that all of a sudden I just went back to speaking in tongues, because again, it brought me that comfort. It took me into a place of feeling, I don't know, probably safe. But I think it was that meditative space more than anything. It certainly wasn't a real language, that's for sure.
Brian, do you think it was a meditative state? And I'm not saying it's not. Or do you think, like when you did it years later, it was like an association with this was God or this was spiritual? And, if you were feeling it in any way in need, being able to do that was like an association to something comfortable rather than it actually a bit of both, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to pray about that and get back to you and see what the Lord says.
It's interesting. There's I don't know much about this field, but there are people that help people with phobias and so on, flying phobias and so on, and they have little little rituals, very small rituals that they do that help them when they're feeling this fear of flying or something like that. And it could be like putting their thumb up on the roof of their mouth, or just sort of tapping their hand a little bit with the other hand. And it because, as you said, Troy, it's an association thing. You sort of learn that to feel relaxed, and when you're feeling relaxed, maybe in a slightly hypnotic state, you do this action, and then when you're feeling that anxiety, you do that action again, and it sort of calms you down. So it could well be something very similar happening, but I don't know the science behind it.
Yeah, it also sounds a lot like, obviously, take it or leave it. It sounds a lot like stimming as well. Like things that bring comfort by like making noises. Making noises, or making like you said, like people that do things like you said, like with the touching the roof of the mouth, like that can be like stimming behavior as well. So it could be playing into things like that for some people and things.
I think the association piece is still quite important to a lot of us even later. And what I mean by that is we're not comfortable speaking in tongues because it was such a holy thing. Even now, having left recently on another podcast, I was on a podcast with a group of other Pentecostals and I actually did it, but it's not easy. It's not easy for me to sort of turn it on cue, because we were told don't do it that way. You have to be in the right setting. And so it's funny because even now I don't like doing it, but the association now is not that it brings me comfort. It actually triggers me. And I don't mean that in the sort of millennial trigger. I mean a literal psychological trigger that I actually start to trigger. It takes me back to a time, and it takes me back, I think it taps into the trauma of it all. So there's an association there in a negative way for me now. And even the other day when we're on this other podcast and I started speaking in tongues, the other Pentecostal, the woman that was hosting, I could see she was totally uncomfortable because she didn't start doing it, and she was raised with it as well. So you won't hear a lot of ex-Pentecostals doing it. I think equate it to the idea of, like, if I gave you a Bible, like a J-Dub Bible, and said set it on fire, you would, you could probably do it, but you wouldn't feel comfortable doing that because of what it meant to you.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And the funny thing is, when you sort of did your little very short bit of that, a little part of me was a bit like, if not scared, a little bit hesitant, because we were
he's got demons.
He's got demons. Exactly. This is a demonic influence thing. So we were conditioned to believe that. So yeah, we wouldn't want to hear people speaking in tongues, because it was actually demons acting through the person. So these are so deep, these psychological conditions or conditioning that we've experienced. Really interesting.
And this was brought to us, Stephen, as teenagers, so we were still forming our identity and the way we saw the world and everything. And so this is really, this was sewn into us and into who we are and into our psyche at such a young age. And we were Pentecostals. We were defined by this gift of tongues. And so it's not surprising that we're still a little bit wigged out. And like I said, the other day I was on that podcast and I did it, but I almost fell apart, to be honest. But it was kind of cool to sort of go, and this is me having left 30 years ago, but still just only now being able to go, look what I can do.
Yeah. And this is part of the trauma, the question that I asked before. This is part of what you're trying to unpack afterwards, understanding why you have these responses to some of these things that others wouldn't. I guess that is part of it. Great. Well, it's coming to the evening for you guys, so we won't keep you any longer. If our listeners want to hear more about your story, obviously they should check out your own podcast. I was a teenage fundamentalist on all of the good podcasts app. We talked to you about 2 years ago. So if you wanted to listen to that podcast, it's in our archive. I think it still pops up there. You can see it. But for now, thank you so much, guys, for coming on the show. And really excited about the work you're doing. Keep it up and keep in touch. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
And Stephen, can I also point out, if they want to, if your listeners want to connect with you on our show, episode 82 is where you're actually our guest, and we talk about organizational psychology and cults, which is a great episode.
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks for that. Great. Well, thank you, Brian and Troy, and I'm sure we'll speak again.
We will. See you guys.
Thank
Awesome.
you.